Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the team here at ARAG and also the team at Stephensons today, a very, very warm welcome to you all to the second of our Talk to the Expert series. This one obviously focusing on care, and I do hope you are all keeping safe and well during this time. So here's the agenda. Obviously a very brief intro from me. We'll also look at health and safety, and Alison will be covering that off for us.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. As set out on the first slide there, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fascinating subject of health and safety in the care sector. So the first slide, topics to cover. So I've explained there that we're basically going to touch on key legislation and the main regulator for health and safety, which is the Health and Safety Executive. I've set out some of the key factors to consider when reporting incidents of health and safety to the HSE, and I'll highlight some of the more serious matters that are likely to attract the attention of the Health and Safety Executive, and then I'll finish with some basic compliance tips that I hope that you'll find helpful. So if we can move Hannah to the next slide, which is the background slide. So as Laura touched on, actually, although the Health and Safety Executive continue to investigate some serious incidents, as of April 2015, the CQC became the lead investigator where residents have been harmed due to unsafe or poor quality care. So the day-to-day incidents and issues will be dealt with by the CQC, but certain serious incidents will still be investigated by the Health and Safety Executive. As we all know, this is an area that attracts significant regulation for obvious reasons. So care homes can't, in the event of a fire, for example, just evacuate and get everybody out within 5 to 10 minutes. So it's important to deal with these risks and have an audit trail of doing so. Just as a separate issue as well, this also presents complex PR issues for businesses. So again, fire safety as the example, advice requiring staff to evacuate and leave residents inside a building that's on fire is never going to reflect well if it hits the media. So even if this is advice given by experts, so it's important for businesses to get this right. So if we can move on to the key legislation slide, I've set out the key legislation there. So it's the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974. So section 2, it's the duty of every employer to ensure health and safety at work of all employees. And section 3, it's the duty of every employer to ensure persons not in employment are not exposed to risks to their health and safety. So that's the same duty for third parties. The management of health and safety at work regulations requires the preparation of risk assessments, implementation of necessary measures, appointing of competent people, and arranging information and training for staff. Now, note there that the offences under section 33 of the Act can result in unlimited fines for businesses, and the assessment is based on the turnover and a review of annual accounts, and or imprisonment for individuals of up to 2 years. So the consequences are extremely serious. If we can move on to the next slide, which is the compliance slide. The HSE guidance for care homes states that health and safety should be an integral part of the everyday running of a home and should be clear in the behaviours and attitudes displayed by all. So, for example, we've had CQC inspection reports served as evidence in health and safety prosecutions, as the inspectors will set out how well staff and managers respond to health and safety questions in their discussions, and that's why it's important that it's constantly displayed. So when considering the implementation of health and safety measures, the business should consider, I've set out the points there, how is it demonstrated, do the arrangements work, how well do you monitor and check what's happening, have you learnt when things go wrong, and is health and safety an integral part of the day-to-day processes? So just to touch on the learning when things go wrong point, that should be demonstrated with things like assessment of fire drills, safety evaluations, accident reports, for example. So there needs to be an analysis of what went wrong, a discussion with the staff involved, scheduling of training or even disciplinary action where that's relevant, and that will demonstrate how seriously it's being taken by the business. So to move on to the next slide, which is managing health and safety, I've set out there a checklist of how to manage health and safety according to the HSE. So quite straightforwardly, it's plan, do, check and act. So for plan, say what needs to happen and how it's going to be achieved. Profile the risks you identify, organise activities, decide on preventative measures. Check, monitor the work to see if it's being done safely and investigate the causes of accidents. Act, review your performance and take action on lessons learned. And importantly there, crucially actually, keep the evidence to demonstrate that you have done this. So everything should be stored electronically, because in the event of a serious incident and the physical evidence is destroyed, electronic copies could be the difference between a prosecution or not. So that's a key point. So if I can move on now to RIDDOR reporting, I wanted to touch on RIDDOR as it can be a confusing area. So since 2013, the reporting of injuries, disease and dangerous occurrences regulations require certain incidents to be reported to the HSE. And this is a separate and distinct duty to reporting to the CQC and local authority. The responsible person should be the person to report, and the definition of who is a responsible person changes depending on the circumstances. So I would advise that the HSE website is checked for anyone who thinks that they do need to report. Failing to report can be a separate offence and can attract similar penalties to the substantive offences. So again, unlimited fine and 2 years imprisonment. Records should be kept for 3 years, and as I've mentioned there, some clients of ours originally thought it's better to have no occurrences and therefore blank records. This is generally not the case. It will be pretty implausible for busy businesses to have no issues at all. So regulators are likely to be concerned about record keeping there. If we can move on now to the next two slides, start with the first one if we can, Hannah. Reportable incidents. So again, this can be a confusing area, and the HSE does have a portal for reporting and again some useful step-by-step guidance. So incidents are reportable if they arise out of or in connection with work. Some obvious examples there. So if there is a death that arises out of or in connection with work, it must be reported within 10 days. Accidents involving a specified injury must be reported within 10 days, and I'll come back to that in a second. Accidents where employees are absent for work for more than 7 days is reportable within 15 days. So perhaps surprising to some. So again, as I've mentioned, I've set out some more examples for you to review of reportable incidents if you wish to. But if I can jump to now specified injuries to workers, slide, thanks Hannah. So what does specified injuries mean? There are some obvious examples, so fractures, amputation, loss of sight. Each of these on the portal, the guidance, has individual guidance for the responsible person to consider when there's been an accident. And again, I would recommend that they look at that guidance but for the situation that's occurred with them. Where, on the next slide, I've set out where the extent of an injury is unclear. So there is actually no requirement to make a precautionary report of a specified injury where the extent of the injury is as yet unclear. In fact, we would actually guard against this reporting to the Health and Safety Executive. If it ends up being unnecessary, it can still pique the interest of inspectors and initiate a long and complex investigation. So, as we know, the investigations can be expensive, and the Health and Safety Executive has the power to invoice businesses with the fee for intervention. So if this involves several witnesses, visits, expert reports, preparing for prosecution, the invoices can run into thousands of pounds. So it is something to be aware of. Having said that, we must bear in mind that if the person is incapacitated for more than 7 days, the incident will require reporting under that limb of the regulations. So if we can move on to the next slide. So examples that are likely to be investigated by the Health and Safety Executive. Falls from height, so scaffolders, decorators for example, can obviously result in serious injuries, so the Health and Safety Executive will want to know what's gone wrong. Asbestos removal or work with asbestos is another important type of case that could be relevant to some of these older care homes. Although it was still used up until about the year 2000 in some newer buildings, so it can also be present in those. The removal of some type of asbestos is a reportable job to the Health and Safety Executive, so it's vital to get an expert opinion at an early stage. Work-related stress is a relatively new area, but one to keep an eye on. I know Adam has highlighted this to his client base recently as a developing area. We may find that employers are required by the Health and Safety Executive to protect their staff more carefully, and again, given the stress in care homes relating to the coronavirus pandemic, it could well be a key area to watch. And finally, fire safety again. So fires in care homes can have horrific consequences, as we know. As I touched on before, the evacuation of homes is difficult and dangerous for staff and the fire service. So it's important to stop the fire from happening with correct procedures and guidance. And secondly, to have very safe procedures in place for moving immobile residents if the worst happens. An important point to remember also is that the fire safety cases are generally prosecuted by the fire service as a branch of the local authority. And this can be a difficult situation where the local fire service has been into a home and assessed the fire safety in an expert capacity. They're unlikely to criticise themselves on their assessment, so there is a conflict there, and it's important to get legal advice quickly and often a third-party expert. So just to move on to the last slide there, which is the compliance tips. So health and safety consultants are relatively inexpensive, I found, but worth their weight in gold if there is an issue. So we would certainly recommend that for any complex business. And you also then have somewhere to point to if there is an issue, if you've taken the advice. Regular training for management and staff is key. You can then provide the evidence of that training, the records to show that staff were told what to do and why. And again, that's imperative in investigations and for defending prosecutions. I've said it before, but the Health and Safety Executive website has very good guidance and also template and example documents, such as risk assessments that can be used by businesses. And I would obviously say seek legal advice in the early stages. We can help to manage the situation and protect the interests of the business. So I'm going to end there. I hope you found that helpful, and thank you everybody for your time.